Hello, friends. Lee C. Camp here. You're listening to No Small Endeavor. This is our unabridged interview with Dr. Lee Warren. Dr. Warren, I love this interview. I've listened back through it several times, found it very helpful, and have actually gotten to be friends with Dr. Warren subsequent to this interview, and have grateful for our continued conversations that we've had. This is a remarkable story. Dr. Warren was an Iraq War veteran, a neurosurgeon, practiced brain surgery under some of the most horrific conditions in his deployment, came back to the home, and as you'll hear, experienced grave PTSD, and then subsequent to that, lost his son in a horrific murder. So much of the work that he has done since then is grounded in his own pain and his own trauma and what he's tried to learn about navigating that, and then could speak about that in a way that perhaps only a brain surgeon can, because he's talking about the ways in which we do have the capacity to change our brain, what we might call the good news of neuroplasticity, that you can teach an old dog new tricks, which is indeed good news for a lot of us. Here's Dr. Lee Warren. I hope you find this immensely helpful, as I did. Hey friends, Lee here. If you enjoy our conversations at the intersection of faith, purpose, and living well, then I have the perfect podcast recommendation for you, With and For, hosted by Dr. Pam King. With and For's latest season brings together psychology and spiritual wisdom in a way that feels thoughtful, grounded, deeply human, and it's hosted by my friend Dr. Pam King, a developmental psychologist and ordained minister who offers practical guidance towards a life of thriving. I'd recommend starting with their episode featuring Parker J. Palmer, world-renowned writer, speaker, activist, Quaker elder who focuses on issues in education, spirituality, and social change. A moving and instructive conversation. Can't recommend it enough. Also, check out With and For's special summer series of wisdom practices. Released each Monday, they're short exercises shared by guests that will become a toolkit for thriving. Consider them your experiment in becoming more fully alive. So go ahead, follow With and For, hosted by Dr. Pam King, wherever you're listening now.
When you need to build up your team to handle the growing chaos at work, use Indeed Sponsored Jobs. It gives your job post the boost it needs to be seen and helps reach people with the right skills, certifications, and more. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. That's Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need a hiring hero? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs.
Hello friends, Lee C. Camp here. At No Small Endeavor, you know we spend a lot of time talking about a good life, but the truth is a good life is not something we can figure out alone. It's something we discover together in community. That's why we created Endeavor Together. Endeavor Together helps small groups gather to talk about the big questions of life using episodes of the No Small Endeavor podcast. Each series is a simple 4-week guide with questions, short videos, and prompts designed to spark meaningful conversation. We've just released our newest series called A Good Life. It's a 4-part exploration of what it means to pursue a life worth living in community. Here's how it works. Participants listen to a podcast episode ahead of time, then gather with a group to talk it through. We provide the framework for great conversation. The best part is, thanks to our friends at the Lilly Endowment Incorporated, it's completely free. You can explore A Good Life along with our other conversation series like Let's Disagree Better and Vulnerability by visiting nosmallendeavor.com or clicking the link in the show notes. Dr. Lee Warren is a practicing neurosurgeon, an Iraq War veteran, an award-winning author. His work bridges the gap between neuroscience and faith, offering practical frameworks for mental and emotional healing. And today we're discussing his newest book, The Life-Changing Art of Self-Brain Surgery. Delighted to get to sit with him here in person as he passes through Nashville on his book tour. Welcome, Dr. Warren.
Thanks, Lee. It's good to be with you. Call me Lee.
Good to be with you. And good to have two Lees at the table today. Yes. So thank you for the book. It's a very helpful, very beautiful book. So,
thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm excited to get to talk to you about it today.
I'm grateful to be here.
So self-brain surgery sounds a little daunting.
It does.
So give us kind of a paragraph-long definition of what you mean by self-brain surgery.
Self-brain surgery is this process of commanding the processes that God has already put in place in your brain. Most people are unaware that we have tremendous amount of control over what our brains do and what they become. I think most of us believe that we're sort of at the mercy of the brain we inherited, and once you understand that you actually can change what your brain does and that you don't have to be the victim of it, but you can have agency and control over where it goes, then that's essentially the same thing as I do in surgery when I perform brain surgery on patients. So wielding that mental scalpel, if you will, understanding that you have control and some agency and some power over what your life becomes is that process that I call self-brain surgery.
You're quite open and vulnerable in the book about the way in so much of your work that you've done in the book and in teaching others has kind of come out of some of your own experience. Earlier on, your experience as an Iraq War veteran and doing neurosurgery in that context. So maybe describe a little bit of what that experience was like, and then what unfolded from that for you, and what you learned and had to deal with coming out of that.
Yeah, so I received a scholarship for med school from the Air Force, and as part of that payback for that, I served 4 years of active duty. And the very last part of that, I was deployed to the Iraq War in a combat hospital and did 200 brain surgeries in a tent hospital in the middle of the Sunni Triangle during the busy part of the war. So we got mortared 100 times while I was there. And so I saw a lot of things that you don't see in civilian trauma settings, and a lot of really horrific things, and survived a lot of personal attacks and bombs blowing up and things like that. So I came home, and as a neurosurgeon, not surprising, probably a little bit of a control freak, and that environment, I didn't have any control over anything. So sort of encountered some mental health PTSD, sort of things that I had not expected to have in my life. And it took a long time to work through that and find my feet and my faith again. And had also gone through a divorce while that was happening, while I was in Iraq. And so it took a long time for me to sort of understand what my own brain was doing and how to navigate those waters. And I think that was kind of the genesis and the beginning of my work that we're talking about here today.
When you think back about the unfolding of what became a diagnosis of PTSD, what were some of the things that began to get your attention of, okay, something may be going on with me here that needs some attention?
Right. So the first moment, my wife Lisa and I were driving. We lived in Alabama at the time, and we were driving down the road. I was driving, and we stopped at a red light, and all of a sudden she was shaking me, and she said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "A helicopter flew by and you checked out. You've sat here through 2 cycles of the red light." And I didn't know that. I didn't experience it. And it turned out the day before that happened, we'd been watching television, and there was a show on HBO called Generation Kill, which was about Iraq combat. And there was a scene that we watched where a soldier was injured and they put him on a helicopter, and they said, "We're taking this guy to Balad," which is where I had been. And we talked about that. Lisa and I had a conversation that night about the war, and I hadn't really talked about it. I, in fact, literally came home, and all my uniforms and mementos and things that I brought home from the war, I put in a trunk in the garage of our house and just sort of stuck it out there, which metaphorically, I think, was what I did with my memories and my stories too. And something about that show triggered the next several months of me having some spells where I sort of spaced out and started having nightmares and flashbacks. And ultimately that led to Lisa first telling me, "Hey, you need to talk about what you went through." And I didn't listen to her, of course. But I had a friend at the hospital who was a psychiatrist, and I said, "Hey, I've got this buddy who's having trouble with stuff from the war." He saw right through me. And he said, "Well, you know what you need to do is you need to go out and tell your friend to go out there and unpack his trunk and tell the stories and maybe write and journal." And so that's what we did. And I took Lisa out in the garage, and we unpacked the trunk full of my stuff from the war. And it turns out that almost everybody that we took care of, I never knew their names because they were there such a short time. If they survived, we put them on a plane and got them back to the States really quickly, and didn't know anything about what happened to them or any of that. But I had a thumb drive that was in that trunk that had about 5,000 digital images that I'd taken of cases and scans and all of that. And of all those images, one folder had a name attached to it. And I still don't know why I saved that soldier's name. And we put it in the computer, and I was showing Lisa that case. It was the worst thing I'd ever seen. And she said, "Well, what happened to that guy?" And I said, "Well, I assume he probably died. He had such bad injuries. We stabilized him enough to get him on the plane." But she just Googled his name, and there he was being interviewed on CBS Evening News 5 years after I got home from the war, and he was well. He survived and recovered, and I ended up reaching out to him and connecting with him, and we went to Pittsburgh to meet him and his family. And,
oh, wow.
And that was a real closure moment for me that showed me that some of the work that we did over there mattered and people made it home because of what we did. And that was really a kind of instrumental part of my healing process there.
You also share that another unspeakable grief that you dealt with was the death of a son, Mitch, age 19.
Yeah.
How would you compare I imagine the grief is not comparable, but is there any comparison between the practice, the experience of grief between those two, coming back from the war and the death of a son, or how would you compare or contrast what you learned or what you had to deal with that new grief?
I think the war was all about stuff danger I was in, for one thing, but also things that I had my hands on, I could interact with, and there was an understanding of why it was happening. The countries were at war, and people were trying to kill each other, and I had an understanding of why these terrible things were happening. With Mitch, he was okay one day and he was gone the next. He was stabbed to death, and there was no context for that. There was nothing that made us understand it or be able to put my hands on it and operate on it like I could a patient in Iraq. And so I think they're just vastly different things. And from my experience, it was a loss we didn't anticipate, not in the context of a war where you expected people to die, and you just don't ever expect your children to die before you do. And so I think I don't think there is any sort of comparison. They both hurt, and whatever kind of trauma people go through is their trauma and their experience. But the loss of a child, at least in my experience in my 56 years, is unparalleled among the things I've felt.
What was your relationship with your faith like during that time of grieving?
I was really mad. You and I talked a moment ago about lament and how the American church doesn't really lament. And I grew up in a faith tradition where you were supposed to be happy. Like you were supposed to, if you were saved and God loved you, and you were supposed to be happy. And I didn't have a context for being really angry at God, and I didn't know what to do with that. And so I doubted, why would God let that happen? I think all the normal questions that people ask, why God let this happen? What kind of a God would do this? And maybe there isn't one. All those things that I went through. And I think what saved me there, besides Lisa and our other kids and family being around me, but I think what saved me is I really needed to believe in the resurrection promise. I needed to believe that I would get to see Mitch again. And I taught patients that for my whole career as a neurosurgeon. When I dealt with somebody dying of a brain tumor, I always taught them about hope and how important it is to hold on and to believe that life means something, even if you can't control the circumstances of it and all those things. And I started looking for, if it's true that there's a resurrection and I get to see my son again someday, then all the other promises of God need to be true too. And so I started looking for stuff that was closer, that felt true. And I found Psalm 34:18, the Lord is close to the brokenhearted. And I would find these moments, even just in the days after Mitch died, where I was at the worst, darkest, deepest pit I could be in, and the phone would ding and somebody would send me a scripture or something that was encouraging, or Lisa would walk in right at the right moment with a hug, or one of the kids would have a memory of something that made me smile and remember that it wasn't all dark at the time. And our first granddaughter, incidentally, Scarlett, was born on the day we buried Mitch.
Oh, wow.
And so our daughter was unable to be at her brother's funeral, and all that stuff was going on too. But at the same time as we were having a funeral, we were getting pictures of the baby being born. And it was just it just felt like, okay, God is close to us in this moment when we're brokenhearted. And maybe that promise of getting to see Mitch again is true too. And so I just started looking for promises that felt true. And as I kept just sort of navigating that, they started feeling like rungs on a ladder that was leading me up out of the darkest part of that place.
Yeah, that's lovely. If I remember the timeline correctly, you not long after you go back to work, you and Lisa have an experience in an MRI research center that's important in your story.
That's right. So, of course, owning our own business, Lisa ran our practice. We had 10 employees. There was a period of time after Mitch died that we just had to go back to work, and you got to keep the lights on. in the business, and the patients are going to start calling other doctors if you don't go back. So there was this business necessity that we went back long before we would have felt like going back. And our office at the time on the Auburn University campus was on the third floor of this building in which they were doing world-class MRI research in something called functional MRI, which is when you get a normal MRI of your knee or your brain or your head or whatever, it just shows you a picture of the organ, right? Here's what the bone looks like. Here's what the brain looks like. Functional imaging is a picture of what the organ is doing. And so we can actually see what parts of the brain are active when you're moving your thumb or thinking about something. And so we were invited to watch this research happen at a really high level. And we went down to watch this because didn't have anything else to do. We were, just need to pass the time and grieve. And so we went down to watch this, and they put this lady in the scanner, Lee, with a headset on so they could communicate with her. And so just lie there for a moment, let us calibrate the machine. And you could see that her brain wasn't doing particularly anything, and she was just chilling in the scanner. And then they said, okay, Mrs. Johnson, think about the worst day of your whole life. Think about the hardest moment you've ever encountered. And very quickly, you could see her sort of furrow her brow and think of whatever it was that she was thinking about. And quickly after that, different parts of her brain that I recognized as a neurosurgeon to be related to fear and anxiety, and the amygdala and hippocampus and the limbic system stuff start reacting to what she's thinking about. And then shortly after that, her physiology began to react to what her brain was doing. So her heart rate went up and her blood pressure went up and her respiratory rate went up. And I could see her think something that turned into brain activity. And then that brain activity turned into body activity, really short order. And then they said, okay, Mrs. Johnson, now stop thinking about that and start thinking about the happiest thing you can remember, the best day of your life. And she thought for a moment and then kind of smiled. And then her brain started reacting differently. Frontal lobe, nucleus accumbens, anterior cingulate gyrus, the parts involved in emotional processing of happy memories and all those things and thought. And the amygdala and hippocampus start calming down. And then her blood pressure comes down, her heart rate comes down, and her body is responding to different thought substrate. And Lisa had this moment where she said, that reminds me of Philippians 4. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, when it says, don't be anxious, be grateful, or think about this and not that, and you won't be as anxious, and God's peace will guard your heart. And I thought, wow, that's exactly what we're seeing. We're seeing that the brain and the mind are not the same thing, that you can think something and your brain will respond to it. And that is exactly what Philippians 4 says. It says, whatever is noble and lovely and good, think about that stuff and you'll feel better. And I'm not a charismatic guy. I think you and I have similar faith backgrounds. So I'm the last guy in the world that'll say God said something to me in an audible voice. I hardly ever say that. But I had this moment where there was a connection between what I was seeing and what I did with my profession. And what I've heard, I want to say that, was when I go to surgery to perform brain surgery, I am intentionally making a structural change in somebody's brain for the purpose of helping them become healthier, feel better, be happier, survive their problem. And when I was watching this person change what they thought about from sad to happy or from bad to good or whatever, I was watching a person intentionally change the structure of their brain for the purpose of making their life better in some way, which is exactly what the Bible did say. But so in every sense, then, changing your thoughts to direct your brain to do something different that leads to your body doing something different. That means that there's genes being transcribed and neurotransmitters getting produced and hormones getting released and physiological targets being activated. And now we know about epigenetics, I'm sure we'll talk about, and all these different things happening in response to what started as a thought. That's surgery. It's exactly like I do in the operating room. You're structurally changing your brain. And the prevailing thought in neuroscience when I was training was you inherit the brain that you have, and it sort of tells you how your life's going to turn out to be. In fact, most neuroscience education still to this day says you are the product of your brain activity. That everything about you and your personality and your dreams and your hopes and all that are just how the neurons in your brain act. But now we can see on functional MRI scans, and I was watching it in real time, like you actually are, your brain is the product of what you think about. And so we just got to see that. And that's really what began to turn my life around and what began to turn into what I've now spent the last 12 years studying and writing about and podcasting and writing books about. Like it's this process of finding the hope and knowing that you're not just stuck with the brain that you have. And as a bereaved parent, that matters because you're hearing all kinds of stuff in your head that this is never going to be better than this. This is never going to improve from here. And it turns out not to be true.
Yeah. So it seems to me that that part that you just described, the distinction between mind and brain, is kind of the crux of it all, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so help people with the concept that these are not the same thing. That and maybe especially if you could help us at the kind of physiological level or neurological level or whatever of how these two are distinguished one from the other.
Right. So traditional neuroscience would say that mind is an epiphenomenon, a product of brain activity. That so your consciousness, your ability to perceive that you have a self and that you're thinking about what you're thinking about and all those things is just generated by the electrical activity of cells in your brain.
So your brain is the primary.
Your brain is everything.
Is everything.
In fact, there's neuroscientists who say don't even talk about self, don't even talk about me, because you're just a brain. Like when you die, you're gone. That's all there is to it. Like it's an illusion. Consciousness is an illusion. There's this whole book's been written about that. But now with functional imaging, we see quite a different story. It's getting much harder to believe that your brain generates your mind, because and neurosurgeons like Wilder Penfield and people for the last 30, 40, 50 years have experimentally and experientially seen where the brain in seizure activity, for example, nobody ever has a seizure that's an electrical event, right? If neurons are firing and creating electrical events, nobody ever has a seizure and thinks about Shakespeare's plays or chess moves. They have seizures that make them move uncontrollably, and they're aware that they can't control that and that they're thinking about trying to control it. But seizure activity doesn't produce rational thought. It produces electrical phenomena. And so you can put somebody in a scanner now and you can see what's actually happening, that somebody can decide, I'm going to think about this thing and not that thing. And the brain does something different than it was doing before you decided to think that. So in a Christian context, if you think about what Christians believe, we believe there's some part of us that lives after our bodies die, right? And so if there's a part of you that lives after your brain is buried or cremated or gone, then that means there's something about you, soul, mind, heart. The brain the Bible conflates these terms. I think they're all the same thing. There's a part of you that is the part of you that was created in God's image and that lives after you die. And I would call that mind. And so with functional imaging now, we can see mind can influence brain structurally. And we know now there's all kinds of research now that show things like when you pray and meditate, for example, your brain, it's not that your brain generates your desire to do that. It's your brain responds to you doing that. And the parts of your brain, like the hippocampus, Andrew Newberg's group at Penn has shown this really well. The hippocampus of the brain gets about 22% bigger in people that practice prayer and meditation for 10 minutes a day for 6 weeks, which means the part that's related to emotional resilience gets structurally stronger and more robust. And so you get more able to handle hard things when you practice faith-based sort of mind down control over your brain. And that's, again, going back to Philippians, that's what it said all along, right? You think this and not that, and you won't be anxious. And so we see that there's a functional difference, even if some neuroscientists might say, well, maybe it's just an epiphenomenon, maybe it just works out that way. But nevertheless, people who, even if you don't believe that there's something supernatural or eternal about it, there is a functional benefit to people thinking of their brain and their mind as separate things, because your brain works better when you give it mental instructions. And we know that about the psychologists have done really good research. About 80% of the things that pop into our heads, the automatic thoughts and feelings that we have, turn out to be false, which means that most of the time when you hear that voice in your own, that sounds like you, that voice in your head that you would think are your thoughts, most of those things aren't true. And so if you're in a belief system where you try to validate your feelings and you try to follow everything that pops into your head, it turns out you spend a lot of time in your life following things that aren't true. And so then we also know there's good research that shows that about 90% of the things that we think about are the same set of things that we thought about the day before.
Well, say that again, that 90% of the things that we think about.
That's right.
We thought about the day before.
Most of us have a pile of stuff that we think about and ruminate on every day. Our marriages, our homes, our mortgages, our businesses, our kids, or whatever. And if you write down the 3 most common thoughts that popped into your head today, if you do that 10 days in a row, they're going to be very similar from day to day. And so if we know that what you think about writes the code of what your brain turns into structurally, and you keep thinking the same things every day, then you're just basically recreating the same brain every day. And that's why people start to feel like this is just how I am. I'm stuck the way that I am. I can't change, because we keep thinking the same thoughts all the time. So especially then if a lot of those thoughts aren't true, and especially if you're a bereaved parent or you've been through something really traumatic, you hear all these things like, I'm such a loser, I can't even raise my own kids, and one of them died. I'm not a good parent. Or who would ever trust me to be a father after my son died? Like those kinds of things that pop into your head automatically. If you believe them and you tell your brain that those things are true, then your life progressively becomes more of the story that you've been living. But if you learn that you can change what you think about and your brain will change what it becomes, then your life doesn't have to look like it's looked in the past.
I will say, that distinction, or at least some mental practices that presume that distinction, wasn't completely new to me. But I think reading your book, I have been more intentional about that distinction. Mm-hmm. And it's just fascinating just how even just a little bit of experimentation with it begins to show some fascinating results. So then back to the phrase self-brain surgery. Mm-hmm. You're not meaning that metaphorically. You're meaning that quite literally, in the sense that we can, by setting our minds on certain things, change the structure of our brains.
That's right.
That there's a distinction between mind and brain that makes that kind of move possible. And then you introduced here this kind of notion of, in effect, that feelings are not facts, and we can begin to interrogate those.
That's right.
So talk to us a little bit more about interrogating the things that come into our mind. What's that look like, or what are concrete practices in that regard?
So if you see the research that says 80% of what you think about automatically and what you feel isn't true, then that means that it would behoove you to develop some sort of process of interrogating that instead of just reacting to it and deciding if something's true before you respond to it. And just that little practice alone, I think, will dramatically change people's quality of life. And the psychologists call that metacognition, this ability to think about our thoughts and feelings rather than just reacting to them or feeling and thinking them and living as if they're true. So as a surgeon, I always think of things in surgical terms. So if you come into my office and you say, Lee, I've been having headaches. If the first thing I said to you was, well, let's go to the operating room and I'll cut you open and look around and see what's going on in there, like, you would be alarmed by that, because that's a very reactive sort of process. I'm saying, well, here's a symptom, let's just go cut it out. And you would encourage me to do a scan or do some sort of data collection before I decided what the problem was. Or probably
I'd be out the door and on my
way to
another.
Or you go get a second opinion, right? So if we can say, okay, knowing that feelings are largely, initially at least, false, or at least they're indicating that something is potentially happening. Your hippocampus and your amygdala, for example, are threat detectors. So they're trying to tell you that something might be happening, but the human brain lacks an ability to discern between something that's really happening and something we're just imagining. So knowing that a lot of those initial automatic things are just information your brain is telling you, but they don't mean anything that's going to be true, then if you can develop this process of interrogating that, getting curious about what you're feeling and thinking rather than just believing it, then you can all of a sudden have some decision-making ability in the process. I don't have to react the way I've always reacted. Again, we make our brains structurally make habit loops of things, and we turn our brains into how we think they have always been because we've always been giving them the same instructions. So if you understand that what you think about, what you decide to think about, has creative control over what your brain becomes, right? Then you're in the driver's seat and you're not just reacting to what you feel anymore. So the phrase you mentioned, feelings aren't facts, they're chemical events in your brain. That's what I call the second commandment of self-brain surgery. I'll give you 10 of those. So that seems like a good number to choose. The 10 most important things I've learned about neuroscience and how neuroscience and faith work together. But feelings aren't facts, they're chemical events in your brain just really is to remind us that an alarming amount of what we feel isn't actually directed at anything that's really happening. Here's a good example. Go to the mailbox and you open up the mailbox and you pull out a letter and you look down and it says IRS, Internal Revenue Service. Many of us would react to that with our skin getting a little clammy and the tingling going up the back of our neck and our hair standing up and we heart would race a little bit and we think, oh no, I'm going to get audited. I was a little creative with my taxes this year. And then maybe some of us would have the same physiological response. So we get a little excited, our hair's standing up and our heart's racing and all that because we're anticipating that refund that we need to make the mortgage payment that we've been worried about. And right now we're feeling the same things. Our physiological reaction is the same. One in anticipation of something bad happening and one in anticipation of something good happening, but neither are true yet because we haven't opened the envelope yet. We're just holding it, and our mind is making context for what we're feeling. So your feeling is telling you, your emotion is telling you something might be happening, and your brain is telling you a story based on the previous things that have happened in your life and the context of how you feel right now and things that you're worried about or things you're anticipating and all that. But nothing is actually true yet, right? And then you look at the envelope a little more carefully and you realize it was addressed to your neighbor. It was put in the wrong mailbox. So none of it was ever true or ever would have been true. But your body was telling you the same story, and it all depended on how you were interpreting it. And so if then you can recognize that, or that in the past you've seen a text message and responded to it quickly and gotten irritated about something and then realized that you read it wrong and you shouldn't have said that to somebody and now you're apologizing. Like you had a thought or a feeling and it wasn't true because you didn't spend enough time investigating it. So just knowing that that process exists, that you can have a physiological reaction to something and it doesn't mean it's true, gives you this ability to get ahead of that curve instead of reacting to stuff and having to apologize or make up for it or try to fix it. You're now in the driver's seat of how am I going to respond? And it turns out that the two parts of your brain that can respond to something you feel are your amygdala, which is about the size of a nickel, or your frontal lobe, which is billions of brain power cells. And if you can decide you're not going to react out of fear or out of that emotional response, but rather get your frontal lobes involved instead, you have tremendously enhanced cognitive ability to bring your best part of your brain to your defense and onto your side when you make the decision of how you're going to respond to something.
Now, I can imagine someone maybe responding, well, that sounds like he's telling me that I ought not feel my feelings, but I don't think that's what you're saying.
That's not at all what I'm saying.
So how I think I know how you'll get there, but how is what you're describing different than repression or suppression of emotion?
Right. I don't want you to repress or suppress anything because just because a lot of your feelings aren't based on anything that's true, it doesn't mean that none of them are. And also, it doesn't mean that when you feel something, it might be generated by something you've been through in the past that's very real. And it's important to honor the struggle and honor the things that we've been through and to understand them. And so if you've been through something in the past and you encounter a similar situation and it triggers something, it brings something up and you feel something, honor that and acknowledge it, but also look at the story and the current moment that you're in and recognize that what you experienced in the past doesn't necessarily mean that what you're experiencing now is the same thing. And if you make a decision based on what you're dealing with now rather than what you're feeling, then you'll have a better time navigating the waters of how you're going forward. That was very similar to my experience after the Iraq War. Like I would hear a firecracker go off on 4th of July and I would feel like I was getting mortared again, but I wasn't. I was feeling something that wasn't happening. And I had to learn how to be with my kids when they were enjoying the 4th of July, even though it made me uncomfortable because I wasn't actually in danger. I was just living a moment that had happened to me 10 years earlier, right? So feel what you're feeling, but don't believe and don't be led around. Let it be a barometer and not a navigation system.
Hello, friends. Lee Seacamp here. There is, as you may have noticed, no shortage of content in the world. Opinions endless, outrage plentiful. Deep wisdom and thoughtful perspective, slightly harder to come by. That's part of why we created the NSC Notebook. It's our weekly email from the world of no small endeavor with reflections on a good life, behind-the-scenes insight into our interviews, and quotes that stuck with me long after those conversations ended. You'll also get a curated list of what I'm reading, watching, and listening to, books, movies, music, and other things I think are actually worth your time. It comes to your inbox every Tuesday, completely free. So if you'd like one less thing to doom scroll and one more thing to actually enjoy, sign up for the NSC Notebook at nosmallendeavor.com. Lee Seacamp here. If you're enjoying this show, I'd love to tell you about a new podcast from Tokens Media called The Subtext. Each week, I sit down with Savannah Locke, a self-admitted pop culture expert, and she helps me catch up on everything I've missed, which, given that I do not own a cell phone, is quite a bit. In fact, They're very pleased. Savannah was very pleased to teach me about the fact that Taylor Swift had gotten engaged about 6 weeks after it happened. So on the subtext, Savannah brings a pop culture moment, celebrity drama, internet debates, viral shows, and together we ask a deeper question. Why does any of this actually matter? What does it reveal about our culture, our theology, and the lives that we are living online and in the public square? And how might we, as Christians, enjoy the world in ways that reflect truth, beauty, and goodness? It's a conversation between someone who lives very much on the internet and someone who lives a lot off of it. And that tension makes for surprisingly meaningful dialogue. If you're looking for a place to begin, I'd suggest our recent episode on the rival Super Bowl halftime shows, a fascinating conversation. So follow the subtext on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen, and join us as we look beneath the headlines and beyond the obvious. Hello, friends. Lee C. Camp here. At No Small Endeavor, we spend a lot of time talking about a good life, but the truth is, a good life is not something we can figure out alone. It's something we discover together in community. That's why we created Endeavor Together. Endeavor Together helps small groups gather to talk about the big questions of life using episodes of the No Small Endeavor podcast. Each series is a simple 4-week guide with questions, short videos, and prompts designed to spark meaningful conversation. We've just released our newest series called A Good Life. It's a 4-part exploration of what it means to pursue a life worth living in community. Here's how it works. Participants listen to a podcast episode ahead of time, then gather with a group to talk it through. We provide the framework for great conversation. The best part is, thanks to our friends at the Lilly Endowment Incorporated, it's completely free. You can explore A Good Life along with our other conversation series like Let's Disagree Better and Vulnerability by visiting nosmallendeavor.com or clicking the link in the show notes. Yeah, I'm flashing back to sitting on my front porch many years ago, and I went through a really nasty couple of year-long, pretty severe depression. And I think as I was, I had finally gotten to the place of where I kind of felt like I could engage the world again in a productive way, but it was still every morning would be just so difficult. And I think that I remember finally journaling one morning saying, I don't like this. This feels miserable, but I have learned that if I will attend to myself for about 60 minutes in the morning, I can get to the place of where I can get through a day okay. Yeah. And maybe that will just be okay. And that, thank God, I didn't stay there. I got better. Yeah. I got a lot better. Yeah. But there was something I think at that moment of where I finally accepted, okay, well, this is who I am. This is what I'm experiencing. And so let's just see what it is and continue to question and continue to investigate and continue to try to accept what I have at that moment. Yeah. And in at least the narrative I tell myself about that time of my life, it was like that was a turning point for me somehow in actually getting better beyond that point. But I don't know, any thoughts on that? Well,
you got yourself into that metacognitive state where you could look at what you're feeling and thinking instead of just living in it. And you're able to communicate with your brain that, hey, this isn't all of what my life is. Like, and you could recognize that you had some agency to think through it and process it differently and begin to respond to it differently. And that's exactly what I'm describing here. Like you can get out of the habit of just feeling and thinking everything that you think and feel. And you said, get curious, get in a top-down mind, down to brain perspective on it, and you start being able to direct what your brain does instead of just being the victim of it.
Yeah. I remember reading at that time a book. I can't remember exactly the title. I'm sure that you probably know the book because it has the F word in the title. But one of his metaphors that he was using was that of a super user on a computer, and that at a super user level you can see all the different processes that are happening on the computer, and that our metacognition is this sort of capacity to see the different processes that are running and to make choices about which ones we're going to keep putting energy into. So, for example, for me, when I was thinking about that, I had this one or two particular loops of obsessive thinking, and that metaphor that he gave me allowed me to step back and say, oh, I'm putting a whole lot of energy into that one today. Yeah. So let's just let that do what it's going to do, but maybe I could turn over here and start putting some energy into this. And I see that being at least a metaphorical description of what you're pointing to.
That's right. I mean, we know now that the brain, because the brain does lots of things at the same time, but in terms of your mind-brain connection and what you can actually think about at any given time, you're not very good at multitasking. Your brain really wants to do one thing at a time cognitively. And so what you're describing there is the reason why those grounding techniques work when you're dealing with anxiety. For example, when people tell you if you're feeling panic, do 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 5 things I can see and 4 things I can touch. And the reason that works is you're using your mind to make your brain say, okay, stop panicking and use your occipital lobe, use your optic nerve to occipital lobe connection and notice 5 things. Make yourself see that lamp and Lee's sweater and all that. And what you're doing is you're stealing blood flow from your amygdala and you're interrupting the metabolic delivery of resources to your brain and you're making it go somewhere else. You're putting it in your occipital lobes or your optic nerves. And then you're going to switch to something auditory and something olfactory or something else, something tactile. And what you're doing literally is you're leveraging that inability to multitask and you're making your brain listen to your mind down command and you're diverting metabolic energy and resources away from panic, anxiety, limbic stuff to frontal lobe or some other part of your brain. And then over time, that panic thing dies off because you've stolen the juice out of it.
Fascinating. So many questions about this, but let me back up to the functional MRI just a moment. What are other things that have been learned through these kind of studies about structures that change in the brain when we give it such and so instructions?
Right.
You mentioned, for example, the hippocampus, and what was that? That it's 22% larger after practicing prayer and meditation for 6 weeks, 10 minutes a day, which is a fascinating study. But other examples like that?
Another really interesting one relates to willpower and resilience. When it comes down to dealing with hardship and going through something hard, there's a part of your brain called the mid-anterior cingulate gyrus, big word, but it's this part right in the middle. And mid-anterior cingulate is sort of like a gear shift in a sort where you're in one emotional state and you want to switch to another one. You're feeling unhappy, you want to feel happy. Your cingulate is involved in switching that. And it's been shown really interestingly, and this is important if you've been bereaved or you've been through something really hard too, to know you can get stuck in an emotional state. You can get sort of stuck in complex grief or stuck in depression or stuck in anxiety. And when you're stuck, functional imaging studies have shown that the mid-anterior cingulate sort of gets like, it's a gear shift, but it gets put into neutral. Like it's not good at moving you from one emotional state to another when you're in that stuck place. But what they've learned is that if you can make yourself do something that you don't want to do, that feels hard or feels distasteful, if you can make yourself do it anyway, like if you're stuck in grief and you don't feel like you can get out of bed, make yourself get out of bed anyway. Then your cingulate sort of says, okay, well, I guess you're telling me I need to do hard things when I don't feel like it. And you begin to reinforce the pathways that are involved in resilience and willpower, and you get more of it. And then that seems to apply across the board to any sort of hard thing that you need to do next. So that they found that if you can make yourself exercise, make yourself make the bed, make yourself call your mom, whatever it is that you don't feel like doing, it has to be novel and it has to be something you don't want to do or don't have motivation to do. Then your cingulate lights up and says, okay, I need to reinforce my ability to get through inertia and move anyway when I don't feel like it. And that's been shown. Mary Frances O'Connor's group at Arizona showed this really nicely, where that is seems to be the trick in getting people out of complex grief, for example, when they've been bereaved and stuck for a long time. That willpower circuit seems to be the trick in getting that done.
That is so fascinating. I'm geeking out. So I teach a lot of kind of virtue theory stuff. And of course, one of the 4 cardinal virtues is courage, which is, this capacity to navigate fear of pain or discomfort. And so one of the things I started doing years ago with my students was encouraging them to practice doing one hard thing every day as a way to do that. And so now I'm hearing kind of some neuroscience that I haven't heard before around that, about why that works. Because I had this sort of experiential notion that this worked and that it changes us in certain ways. So that is just so fascinating.
It sort of ties back to, we talked earlier about how there's stuff in the Bible that neuroscience seems to validate. And this is another one of those things and it was really important to me after losing a son. Like you start to feel like the hard thing you went through begins to define your life, right? And same thing here with grief or with depression. It starts to be the defining characteristic. You think that's who you are. You said that a minute ago. It started to feel like that's who I am. But it turns out, the Bible said in Romans chapter 5, like suffering produces endurance, endurance produces character, character produces hope, right? And now we know that the mid-anterior cingulate actually requires suffering, requires something hard in order to enable you to be the kind of person who can go through hard things and navigate them well. So it just sort of seems to enable us to become more robust people, not in spite of having avoided or gone through something hard, but because we went through something hard.
Yeah. So what do you think, where's the, let me back up on this question. So one of the things that, when I was younger, for a variety of reasons, I was kind of that school of thinking from my family where it was like, if you have any sort of emotion that's what we would call negative in some way,
right,
that you just kind of ignore it and or suppress it, and you should be happy, that kind of thing. And after a while, I realized this is not serving me very well because I'm repressing stuff and it's coming out in really ugly ways. And so then through some therapy, it was like, no, you need to start talking about your feelings and working through your feelings, and as opposed to suppressing them or repressing them. And somewhere along the way, I realized though that there seemed to be a fine line between, for example, acknowledging I was sad and self-pity.
That's right.
Where I could get in, where I knew I had to learn how to to accept, or not accept, but to acknowledge that I felt sad. But what kept happening was once I started doing that, next thing I know, I'm wallowing in self-pity,
That's
and
right.
so it was like, so from your perspective, how does one rightfully note the feelings, interrogate them without it falling into this kind of place that you're describing of where you get stuck in that stuff?
That's right. So the long answer would involve quantum physics. The short answer will involve experience. But so there's this thing in quantum physics called the quantum Zeno effect, where the physicists have figured out that if you observe a system from the same perspective, that the observer begins to influence the system. This sounds really weird, but look up the double slit experiment if you're interested in that. But basically, the quantum Zeno effect is the watched pot never boils kind of thing. Like the longer you observe a system from the same perspective, the system sort of freezes in that space, and it doesn't evolve past what it is that you're looking at. And there's some interesting neuroscience research now that shows the same thing happens when we observe our feelings. The more you think about what you're feeling, and the more you talk about what you're feeling, and the more you worry about what you're feeling, the bigger what you're feeling becomes, and the more real it feels to you. And so that's why there's a fine line between observing, noting, being curious about, and trying to find a way to navigate forward from what you're feeling and dealing with, and descending into it and letting it become all that you are. And so the reason that is because the more you focus on the emotional, experiential part of what it is that you're feeling. I feel really sad. I feel really anxious. Usually when I feel anxious, it makes me feel panicky. I can't go to this place because if I do, it's going to make me feel more anxious, right? You start to navigate your life around trying to avoid that thing that you feel in that circumstance. The more you do that, you're amplifying that quantum Zeno effect, and you're making that thing that is real and does need to be understood, but you're making it control you instead of you being able to control it. When you rather note it and be aware of it, and then question the feeling and thought like we talked about earlier, do that thought biopsy like we talked about, then you begin to be able to say, okay, is it going to serve me well if I allow this thing to blossom and amplify, or do I need to find a way to put it in the context of what my life really wants to be going forward and manage it rather than letting it manage me? Because the nervous system's going to manage you if you don't manage it.
So much of this, isn't it, relates to, as I understand it, the fact that our brain wants to be very efficient with its energy, and so it looks for things to automate.
That's right.
And so the idea here is that, as I understand it, is that a lot of times our thought cycles that we can get stuck on are things that our brain has decided to automate. And then what you're suggesting is we can begin to make those choices and say, okay, that automation is not necessarily helping me.
That's right.
So let's try a better automation or a different kind of route. And tell us more about that.
So the underlying process that's happening is called neuroplasticity. That's the ability that the brain has of disconnecting one neuron from another, or a network of neurons from another network, and making new connections either to the same set of neurons or to other ones. And what we know now is that neuroplasticity process is happening 24/7 all the time in your brain, that you've never had a brain that was stuck in any particular format, because neurons are disconnecting and reconnecting in real time all the time. And then it turns out that the thing that drives that connection process more than anything else turns out to be what you're thinking about. And so that's why earlier I said, if you keep thinking the same stuff, your brain's just rewiring itself. But along that process of neuroplasticity happening, rewiring, your brain listens to what you tell it to rewire, and the things that tend to be wired frequently get reinforced. And so it'd be like if you kept plugging multiple things into the same outlet in your house, if your house responded by laying down more copper wires on the inside of the walls and making that connection more efficient, and taking copper from some other place and moving it to outlets that you don't use, your brain actually does that. Like, it disconnects neurons that aren't getting used and uses those materials, microtubules and other proteins and stuff, to remake more robust connections in things that are being used. That's why we talked about those 10 commandments of self-brain surgery a while ago. Number 9 is, I must believe that what I'm doing, I'm getting better at. And that means it's a nod to neuroplasticity, to this idea of neurons that fire together, wire together. Like, you're literally making your brain better able to automate that process by doing that process more often. So back up a step from that. Most of us grew up in a particular environment, in a house with a family, with rules of engagement and all that. And before you ever had words, or before you could ever think about the life you were living, you had a lot of things that were accepted as how you're going to view the world and how you're going to interact with the world. So it's not surprising then that most of us grow up and we think, this is just how I am, the way I think, the way I feel. And we didn't understand. But what was actually happening is you were giving your brain, with your mind, you were giving it consent to automate a lot of things about how you seem to be wired, long before you understood that you had any agency or control in that process. And so then when you get to adulthood, and all of a sudden you start wondering, why do I feel this way all the time? Why do I react that way all the time? Maybe I just got it from my dad. The truth is, you gave your brain a series of instructions a long time ago that it was okay to automate a bunch of things that you didn't even understand were automated. And so the beauty of it is that as soon as you start to think about whether or not that automation sequence is helping you, you can begin in real time. We know now that microtubule connections between neurons break and remake within seconds of a new mental instruction. And so that means you think something's long-standing and can't be changed in your life, it actually begins to degrade and change as soon as you think one thing and not another thing. And so that's where the agency and hope lies. And that's why I think people need to think of themselves as brain surgeons, because you literally can say, this isn't serving me. I want to disconnect this automation and figure out how to make a new automation. And it turns out the process of doing that requires repetition and a lot of intention.
So you can teach old dogs new tricks.
You can.
Yeah. Is there any indication that our neuroplasticity degrades as we age?
Actually, no. It's a practice that requires repetition, but it's been shown in every age group that neuroplasticity is still the mechanism of how the brain works all the time. So I always get this a lot from people that say, well, it's fine for you to say that, but you don't know what I've been through. You don't know what you don't know what my background is. You don't know what my family was like. You don't know the trauma I've been through. The fact is, neuroplasticity works the same way for everybody. You just might need some more help to get this process working for you and not against you. You have to sometimes require professional help to understand how to wield it on your own behalf.
Talk to us about reticular activating system and how that works.
So most of us believe, Lee, that we're pretty savvy folks and that we see with our own eyes and we are able to recognize what reality is for our lives. Like, most of us think that we see it pretty clear. We can call it for what it is. But the truth is, what reality is largely what your brain is filtering to look for. And there's a lot of things that are true, that you aren't seeing if you're filtering the wrong way. And that filtering process is the reticular activating system of your brain, which is a bunch of neurons in the brainstem primarily that do a lot of things. They're involved in consciousness and arousal, but also filtering. And literally, when you think to yourself, like you oversleep your alarm and you say to yourself, oh no, it's going to be a terrible day. I'm going to be late. I'm going to get fired. And my boss is going to be mad at me or whatever. You tell your brain to look for evidence that you're about to have a bad day. And before you know it, everything you see reinforces the idea that this is going to be a lousy day. Like you can't see, you're running down the hall on your way to work and your little girl drew a picture for you. She's trying to hold it up and get your attention, but you don't see her because you're too busy getting to work. You don't see the beautiful flowers in your driveway or the sunrise or whatever because you're too busy thinking about what a lousy day it's going to be and how late you are and all those things. You miss things that are still true, right? And the reason you miss them is because your brain is looking for evidence to support what you told it was going to be true about this day. And that's why a text message from your wife with the exact same words can mean something very different from one day to another because it depends on your mood and your emotional state and whether you're hungry or tired or sad or angry or whatever. The same words can mean two very different things. Why is she being such a jerk? Or, oh, I got the greatest wife in the world. Of course I do. But it's what you're filtering for is actually what you perceive as reality. And so the reticular activating system is the hardware of how that works. And it listens instantly for mental command as to what to set the filter to look for.
I've thought of that as like, and tell me if this is right or wrong, but I've thought of an example of that as if you decide, say, you're going to buy a Toyota Camry.
Yep.
And previously you're not noticing Toyota Camrys,
That's
but
right.
then you decide you're going to buy one or you buy one and then you see them all over the place.
That's right.
Is that an example of that system?
It is. It's called the Bader-Meinhof phenomenon is the psychology term for that thing. If you see a yellow Ferrari you never noticed before, all of a sudden you see them everywhere. You're interested in a watch or a sweater, all of a sudden everybody's got it and you thought you were the only one. There's a famous experiment. You should YouTube it if you're interested in this kind of thing to the listener. Look up the gorilla experiment. Have you seen that?
I know of it, yes.
Right. So there's two basketball teams, one wearing a blue jersey and one wearing a red or something like that. And these research subjects are told to count how many times the white team or the red team passes the ball. And they start counting and they watch for 2 minutes and they said, well, how many times did they pass the ball? I said, well, 12 times. And they said, well, how many times did the gorilla cross the screen? And they'll say, what gorilla? And you watch the tape again and there was a guy in a gorilla suit walking around the basketball court the whole time. Nobody noticed it. It's been shown, very good research, more than 60% of people never see the gorilla because they're looking for counting how many times the ball was passed. Right? And so once somebody tells you that, you see it every time after that. That's the Bader-Meinhof phenomenon, and that works because of the reticular activating system and its filtering.
That's fascinating. I mean, I assume that's the case, that we have that system, or that one of the things that system does for us is that I assume that we get so much input through our eyes, ears, all of our sensing that it's too much to file it all.
That's right.
And we have to filter it in some way.
Right.
Is that kind of the basic?
It is, and it's also in terms of survival, for example, if you need to really focus on your environment and find the leopard that's trying to kill you out there, or you're in a restaurant and you're trying to hear one conversation across the room, you can do that, right? You can focus your ears and hear somebody talking, even though there's lots of sound. That's all related to this same phenomenon.
I've also seen some speculation that system may be one reason that goal setting works, in that if I 'cause I remember one time after reading that, I thought, okay, well, I'm just going to set a goal for something that I think for this point would be a little bizarre beyond my reach, but I'm just going to test this. And so I set this particular goal, and I was shocked that within 6 months, someone was calling me to say, would you like to do such and so? And we have somebody who helped pay for that.
Right.
But the way I understood the theorizing about goal setting in this was that there's so many things going around us all the time, like the gorillas, right, that we don't see.
Yeah.
But once you set your filter that this is what I want to accomplish, that it may be that the gorilla is right, your so-called gorilla, whatever the resource is that you need, may be right there, and you just have to open your eyes to it. But I don't know, any other thoughts or comments around that?
this spectrum of brain science, and then on the other side of the spectrum is what we would call metaphysics, right? The people that talk about manifesting things, which is a little bit related to goal setting, but this belief that you can sort of decide what to look for in the universe, and the universe will give it to you. That these people that believe that they can manifest millions of dollars or whatever, that's the same idea that they're trying to leverage. But really what it is not magic. It's the ability to hyper-focus on stuff that was already there or potentially possible for you that you're now looking for actively, and making mental decisions and taking steps towards that you might not have if you hadn't set those filters and goals.
Yeah, fascinating. So epigenetics, I've only recently begun to kind of even try to wrap my brain around this.
Right.
But I think the Dr. Levine, I don't know if you know of his work, but he does a lot on the body and trauma. And I think he was the one that first introduced me to this study that was done at Emory, where I think it was they exposed mice to
cherry blossoms.
Yeah. And then they shocked them, traumatized them along with the scent of the cherry blossoms. And so they ended up high anxiety response with defecating on themselves. Then they, 6 generations later, the scent of cherry blossoms would still do that same thing, have that same response.
To their offspring.
To their offspring, yeah. And that just kind of blew my mind. But how do you see that kind of reality? First, maybe describe to us in terms of what's going on in the brain, how that works, and then how that realization can be leveraged for our good.
Right. So a lot of things that you feel and you think are who you are actually the product of epigenetic things that happened in generations prior to you. So what we learned from the mice was that when a mouse, they studied the male mouse, when they're exposed to a traumatic event, it changes the genes that code for their trauma response for how much cortisol and adrenaline they have in their bodies. And that baseline elevated cortisol state was inherited to serve, as you said, 4 or 5 generations down, so that your basically great grandkids could be born as if they'd been exposed to something traumatic when they had not been. And so they had abnormal baseline cortisol responses. That's been reproduced in humans that went through, they looked at generations of Holocaust survivors, and they looked at Vietnam veterans who had PTSD and their offspring down to 2 or 3 generations. And it's been shown.
So we may be literally, if we have a sort of disproportionate anxious response to something, we may be literally experiencing what our great-grandfather was experiencing.
That's exactly right. So if your parents, grandparents, great-grandparents were exposed to horrific, hard things, or if they just weren't very good at managing stress, it's not that you inherited the wrong genes. Epigenetics doesn't mean that you inherit a set of genes, because we all pretty much have the same substrate genetically. What epigenetics is the controlling factors that decide which genes get turned on and turned off, and how those are inherited in the next generation. Those switches, they're different chemical markers that get put on genes that turn on DNA transcription or not. And so
the switches get
changed, and that is heritable.
Okay.
So not just that you got the wrong set of genes, and this is why identical twins, by the way, don't have the same disease profiles. They don't live the same lifespans. It's not because they inherited different genes, because they literally inherited the same genes. It's which ones are turned on and off, and that's environmental. It's partly psychological. It's partly based on experiential stuff. And so you inherit stuff the same as your identical twin, but you don't live the same lives. And your offspring inherit different genes, different sets of switched on or switched off genes. So that's epigenetics, the stuff outside the actual genes themselves that control whether or not those genes are transcribed, turned on or off. Okay. So what's interesting about that in our lives is, as you said, we can be afraid of things. We can react as if we're afraid of things that our great grandparents were exposed to. The mouse study looked at what happens in the offspring. And if you train them that the cherry blossom smell will not shock them, then their offspring are born with a normal cortisol response again. So you undo the damage that was done down 4 or 5 generations ago, and in the next generation, those mice pups could be born with a normal trauma response.
That's amazing.
That's also been replicated in humans, that they can see that humans can be improved in their responses, and their epigenetics can change. Epigenetic control of genes can be changed within a single generation. Now, in terms of faith things, there's this interesting thing in the Bible. It talks about generational curses that we talk about,
Right.
where that verse in Deuteronomy that says, the sins of the father visited on the sons and grandkids down to the fourth generation. What if that's not actually a threat or God bullying people? What if it's actually just kind of a warning that, hey, the stuff you do in your life affects your great grandkids? It affects how their genes are turned on and turned off. And there's hope, because the back end of that verse says, but the favor lasts 1,000 generations, right? So if you get it right, if you're born with stuff that you didn't like, that turns out not to be helpful to you, that your parents went through or didn't go through, then you can learn a different way to process what you've been through, and your kids and grandkids and their grandkids will be born better off than you were in terms of how you handle stress and how emotionally resilient you are. Isn't that amazing?
It's amazing. And it's sobering. I mean, I think that because I'm drawing a blank on who the guest was that we were talking about this most recently. But I was talking to another psychiatrist friend of mine on a walk one day about this stuff, and I was saying to him, I said, look, what I think about when I hear this about epigenetics is the fact that one of my great grandfathers committed suicide, and on the other side, another one of my great grandfathers was a raging alcoholic, and so you think, who knows what they were dealing with that got handed down to them. And then I think in terms of, well, what's the sort, when I realize how much I've dealt with anxiety and or depression, it's like, oh, well, maybe, the helpful part of it is maybe I'm dealing with stuff that doesn't have anything to do with me at one level.
That's right.
But it's also a sort of heavy weight, because you think, oh, I realize that stuff's kind of coming to me now, right? But right. I think that the good news, of course, I guess would be the good news of neuroplasticity, I suppose. That's right? Is that we're not our parents or our grandparents or our great grandparents.
And you're literally never stuck with the brain you have or the genes you inherited, whether or not they were on or off, because all of those things come under the controlling influence of the things that you're thinking about and working on in your own life. And so that gives us opportunity and agency that things can be different in the future than they have been in the past. And also sort of gives us responsibility. Like if you don't want your kids to be as anxious and stressed as you were, you work on it now, and it's likely that your kids won't have to deal with some of the things that you had to deal with. Yeah.
Yeah. You do, you talk about a whole system scan as a key practice. So help us with that.
Well, just, again, trying to use terms that relate to how I practice, because I want people to feel like they have a practice that they need to get after of managing these processes. One of the most important things I do is imaging my patient. So I want to know what's going on with my patient. I put them in a scanner, figure out what's happening inside their body so I know how to make an appropriate response to it. So I teach this sort of, and body scanning has been around. A lot of therapists talk about that. It's just the idea of, before you react to something, before you decide that something is or isn't real or a threat to you, scan yourself first. Think through all the different parts of your body, all the different things you're feeling, all the different things you're thinking. Get curious about them and decide that this thing I'm feeling isn't going to help me manage this meeting I'm about to go into. This pain I'm dealing with in my shoulder isn't going to help me. I need to not focus on that right now. I need to focus on this. So just get this practice of mentally putting yourself in a whole body scanner, if you will, seeing every part of your emotional life, your thought life, your physical body, things you're dealing with that might be draining you, keeping you from being fully present, and just scan yourself and take note of the things that might be distracting, might be harmful, might need to be addressed really quickly. And I think it's a healthy practice.
You talk some about folks dealing with chronic pain. Any commentary on helps in that regard?
Yeah, so the self-brain surgery, I give you an operation. There's 15 operations in the book that deal with these practical things, and one of them is chronic pain. And chronic pain, I think the biggest thing people need to know is that our perception is that if something hurts, it's because something is wrong, that there's got to be something wrong. The doctors are missing. And I'm sensitive to this because I had a patient commit suicide who had brain surgery to remove a benign tumor she was cured of the tumor. It was gone. And every scan showed the tumor was gone. But she still felt in her mind as if that tumor was growing back. She could feel where the incision had been made. And she was constantly worried that scalp sensation that she had equated to the tumor coming back. And she got so stressed about it that even though multiple surgeons, she went to 5 or 6 of us, multiple scans were done, multiple studies were performed, there was no evidence of any sort of recurrence of disease. She ultimately killed herself because she felt it would be better just to end her life than to deal with this inevitable tumor coming back that she had. And so I'm sensitive to this idea that what we feel can become so real to us that we feel like there's something wrong even when there might not be. Chronic pain research has shown, and it's really fascinating, chronic pain doesn't light up in the brain in the part where your previous injury was. So if you had an injury to your leg, for example, and you mangled your leg in some kind of accident, or you have phantom limb syndrome from an amputation, when you experience the chronic aspect of that pain, it's not the part of your brain that maps to where that leg is on your body. It's actually a memory circuit that lights up. And so what we're feeling when we feel chronic pain is actually a memory of what that pain felt like, not the part of your brain representing that part of your body. And so that means that the best hopeful research in looking at how to manage chronic pain actually turns out to be how do we process and think about what we're remembering rather than thinking that what we're feeling has to mean that there's something wrong with our body. And so if you can learn then to interrogate your feelings about what you had been through when you were injured in that way, you can start to unwind some of those chronic pain signals. And people are learning to be able to navigate and manage them a lot more effectively than they can with pain medication. It's been shown, for example, that cognitive behavioral therapy seems to be as or more effective than pain medication in a lot of patients that have chronic pain syndrome. And that's why.
And then what's research showing on the way trauma can set up those sorts of chronic memory loops?
So trauma is another one of those things that creates an opportunity for intervention here once we understand the difference between our response to the traumatic event and the actual traumatic event itself. And so Gabor Mate has written about this a lot, where it turns out that what we think of as trauma isn't actually the thing that we went through. It's the set of physiological things, the memories, the way that the story that we tell ourselves about what it is that we went through, and the way that we've navigated our life after that traumatic event happened. That's what trauma really is. And that's good news because, like for me, for example, having lost my son, it's always going to be true that my son was killed. And if my trauma response was because my son was killed, I would not be able to manage that. I couldn't change it because that's always going to be true. But it turns out if you're over drinking, if you become abusive, if you become addicted to anxiety medications or something as a response to something hard that you went through, that's the trauma. It's the set of things you think about and feel and the responses you've chosen, even subconsciously chosen, in response to what you went through. And so the real work that's helping people with trauma recovery now turns out to be understanding the responses that you've generated and working on a healthier response if the one that you've developed isn't serving you well. And so you can't change what actually happened, but you can change the way that you've been navigating what happened. And that's where all the hope lies. It's really powerful to know that the trauma response that you have developed isn't fixed. Again, it goes back to neuroplasticity. You can change that as soon as you decide it's not helping you.
I guess that relates to I forget who I was reading this in, maybe Martin Seligman, positive psychology guy, talking about the distinction between PTSD and I think what he called post-traumatic growth, and that there's different people can respond in different ways to the same occurrence.
That's right.
And that as I recollect, he argues that what happens to you in the what you're calling the trauma may in large part depend upon what kind of strategies, mechanisms, mental health you had prior to that you can then employ and leverage on the backside of the event. Is that the way you understand that then?
It's exactly right. And it goes back to some of the things we talked about earlier, like with neuroplasticity and with understanding the incredible power that your mind has over what your brain becomes structurally. So if you've been under the belief that that you're obligated to have a negative life going forward if you experience a certain set of things. And a lot of people are, especially these days. A lot of people have this belief that we're inherently fragile and easily broken. And if a certain set of things happen to you, you're just going to have a rough life and you need to just prepare for having a difficult life. But you can look back through history and see lots of people have been through incredibly hard things. Like look at Viktor Frankl and the concentration camps and the Blitzkrieg folks in England. Like a very small number of those people developed what we would call PTSD now because they had community. They'd all gone through hard things together and they had to rebuild their country. That they started doing things after they went through those hard things to rebuild and move forward together collectively, rather than saying, gosh, we went through this incredibly traumatic event. I guess we're all going to be wrecked by it. Let's sit around and think about how wrecked we are by it. So again, understanding that the way that you have been responding has been creating what your future looks like now or what your current reality looks like now. And then seeing that there's a large group of people who have gotten better and found meaning and purpose in their lives after they went through something hard because they went through something hard. I hope I'm a good example of that. That's really why I wrote this book, Lee, is to say you can go through incredibly hard things and it can turn out to help you find meaning and purpose in your life. And rather than defining your life, it can sort of refine your life in a way. There's a lot of things about me that are, it's hard to say this, that are better than they were before I lost my son. Not that it's a good thing that I lost him. I would trade it all to have him back. But God's promise of suffering producing endurance and character and hope turns out to be true, and it's true neurologically, as we talked about earlier with the cingulate gyrus. Like trauma can refine and clarify your future if you develop a response that helps you and doesn't hurt you.
So as we close then, imagine a listener who resonates with a lot of this. Where do they start? What would you suggest that are some first steps for them?
I think the first step is get curious about what you think and feel, rather than thinking that you're obligated to react as if it's true. So just maybe develop a habit of journaling a couple minutes a day. What are the 3 things I thought about most frequently today? And what are the 3 things I thought about most frequently tomorrow? And then get into this practice of, Daniel Amen calls it micro miracles, like looking for something you can use to find, to be grateful for in a day, even if it's a bad day. Like take a second to find something that you can modify the substrate of what you've been thinking about. And instead of all that doom and gloom, you can find something to be grateful for, because it turns out that gratitude is the thing that switches from that amygdala fear response up to that frontal lobe processing, rational thought process response. And so if you're struggling with any part of your emotional life, your mental health, or something physical, I would say get curious about what you think and feel and interrupt that process and get outside of it long enough to think about it and decide if it's helping you to respond as if it's true, or if you need to modify your previous responses to make them work better for you.
Talking to Dr. Lee Warren on his latest book, The Life-Changing Art of Self-Brain Surgery. Lee, thanks so much for your beautiful work and your generosity with your time with us today.
It's been a pleasure, Lee. Thank you.
Hello, friends. Lee C. Camp here. At No Small Endeavor, we spend a lot of time talking about a good life, but the truth is a good life is not something we can figure out alone. It's something we discover together in community. That's why we created Endeavor Together. Endeavor Together helps small groups gather to talk about the big questions of life using episodes of the No Small Endeavor podcast. Each series is a simple 4-week guide with questions, short videos, and prompts designed to spark meaningful conversation. We've just released our newest series called A Good Life. It's a 4-part exploration of what it means to pursue a life worth living in community. Here's how it works. Participants listen to a podcast episode ahead of time, then gather with a group to talk it through. We provide the framework for great conversation. The best part is, thanks to our friends at the Lilly Endowment Incorporated, it's completely free. You can explore A Good Life along with our other conversation series like Let's Disagree Better and Vulnerability by visiting nosmallendeavor.com or clicking the link in the show notes. Hello, friends. Lee C. Camp here. There is, as you may have noticed, no shortage of content in the world. Opinions endless, outrage plentiful. Deep wisdom and thoughtful perspective slightly harder to come by. That's part of why we created the NSC Notebook. It's our weekly email from the world of No Small Endeavor with reflections on a good life, behind-the-scenes insight into our interviews, and quotes that stuck with me long after those conversations ended. You'll also get a curated list of what I'm reading, watching, and listening to, books, movies, music, and other things I think are actually worth your time. It comes to your inbox every Tuesday, completely free. So if you'd like one less thing to doom scroll and one more thing to actually enjoy, sign up for the NSE Notebook at nosmallendeavor.com. Hey friends, one of the things that we've learned from listeners is that many of you don't want to just listen to these conversations. You'd like to go deeper than that. That's part of why we created NSC Plus, which is our subscriber community, where we share additional conversations, reflections, and bonus material connected to the themes of the show, especially looking for ways that this can relate to the practice of your own life. Recently, we started a new series called Reflections on a Good Life, in which I share brief reflections arising from some of our favorite NSC interviews. You might think of it as a weekly 7-minute episode in which I pull out some pearl of wisdom from an interview and suggest a question on which you might choose to meditate to further cultivate some goodness in your own life. We've also launched a new bonus series called Books You Should Know. In the first installment, I sat down with Dr. Lee Warren for a conversation that quickly became one of my favorite interviews I've done in quite a while. It's all waiting for you over at NSE Plus. And just as importantly, NSE Plus is what helps keep No Small Endeavor on the air and available for free to everyone. Subscriptions start at just $5 a month, and if these conversations have been meaningful to you, we would truly love to have you join us. You can learn more at nosmallendeavor.com or click the link in the show notes and join NSE Plus. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Carrie Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Sophie Byard, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, and Audrey Griffith. Our theme song was composed by Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of Tokens Media, LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.
Lee C. Camp here. If you're enjoying this show, I'd love to tell you about a new podcast from Tokens Media called The Subtext. Each week, I sit down with Savannah Locke, a self-admitted pop culture expert, and she helps me catch up on everything I've missed, which, given that I do not own a cell phone, is quite a bit. In fact, Savannah was very pleased to teach me about the fact that Taylor Swift had gotten engaged about 6 weeks after it happened. So on The Subtext, Savannah brings a pop culture moment, celebrity drama, internet debates, viral shows, and together we ask a deeper question. Why does any of this actually matter? What does it reveal about our culture, our theology, and the lives that we are living online and in the public square? And how might we, as Christians, enjoy the world in ways that reflect truth, beauty, and goodness? It's a conversation between someone who lives very much on the internet and someone who lives a lot off of it. And that tension makes for surprisingly meaningful dialogue. If you're looking for a place to begin, I'd suggest our recent episode on the rival Super Bowl halftime shows, a fascinating conversation. So follow The Subtext on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen, and join us as we look beneath the headlines and beyond the obvious.